Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's event, Screening and Interviewing. This is the third event in our Labor Trafficking Service Delivery series. My name is Charlie Borg, and I'm the Program Officer at Framework, which is an OVC-funded training and technical assistance program dedicated to providing tools to help you increase identification, improve services, and enhance partnerships so that together we can combat labor trafficking. We offer live events, individual consultation, and a full resource library with practice videos, tip sheets, and other items. On our website, you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter, review our past events like our recent survivor panel on labor trafficking service needs, and feel free to always email us for all of your labor trafficking questions and needs. We have a lot today, so we're really just going to jump into the content, but I wanted to let you know that we have some videos and some questions, so have your phones ready to engage with our trainer. I also wanted to let you know that the tools that we referenced today will be made publicly available and disseminated after the event through email to all people who have registered. And the videos that we use will be shared along with questions and answers so that you can practice your skills with your team and your community. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Cristobal Perez, who is a skilled direct service provider, trainer, program consultant, and published author with over 13 years experience. Chris has received local and nationwide recognitions for his work on human trafficking, and we are honored to have him here today. I also wanted to share, just provider to provider, that over the years serving survivors of violence, I haven't always been able to see and name labor trafficking with the individuals I was working with. Particularly, two individuals come to mind, one survivor of child incest and one adult survivor of intimate partner violence, where if I have these skills, not only do I think that naming and helping them understand their experiences and polyvictimization of labor trafficking and other abuses would have helped with their healing and resource connection, but in these two cases, it would have also helped potentially thwart their criminal justice experience and the criminal history that followed them. So I am so glad that you are here today. I did not have Chris. We have him here for you, and hopefully together as a community, we can all do our best to see these survivors and serve them better. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks so much, Shirley. Can you guys hear me all right? Yeah, perfect. All right. So no, thanks for that introduction. It's always interesting to hear that kind of stuff. But again, yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you guys are at. As Shirley said, my name is Cristobal or Chris Perez. And hopefully you'll find this presentation useful, just as Shirley was saying. And with it, we have 4 goals today that we're looking to address with our presentation called a Labor Trafficking Service Delivery, Screening, and Interviewing. The first objective includes addressing the purpose of screening and interviewing, steps to consider before conducting the screening or interview, and steps to consider during it, and of course, what happens after. So to start, we're actually going to go over some questions so that we're all aware or have a baseline of our audience. And of course, our questions are related to the screening tools that y'all are using actually. So the first question is, are you currently using a screening tool that accounts for labor trafficking? And so we don't want to make any assumptions here. Please let us know. And, I just want to kind of, and please use the QR code to answer these questions, or the chat as well. So Christina, I believe here says no. Yes. Marta. We ask a question or two, but I wouldn't call it a tool. That seems to be the #1 response right now. Christine Cooper, no. Okay. It almost seems like there's like a 50-50 breakdown of no, but I know we should be. Okay, I'm here to learn. Okay. That's great. It's great to see how all this is playing out. what we really need to be. So, okay, it sounds like there might be some kind of moments here that we're going to be able to learn some from. So I'm really excited to see that I think you guys will find something useful out of what we're going to be presenting today. And actually, Shirley, if you don't mind, let's go to the second question now. And it's what's important to you or your agency when reviewing a screening tool? And the reason why we're interested in this is we want you to be very honest, for you to be very honest, and there aren't any right or wrong answers for this. We're just curious to know how you all are prioritizing this type of tool. Okay, so quick, trauma-informed approach. Trauma-informed, okay, so it seems like that there's the trauma component that we're all interested in. That's great to see. Respect, identification, inclusive, trauma-informed, sensitivity, not too intrusive. Okay, let me see here as it's going. Trauma-informed. Okay, and again, please use the QR code. Again, quick, that it's not incriminating. Having tools to be able to respond appropriately. Oh wow, it's going by very quickly. But okay, it sounds like everybody, you guys are including components that we're going to be talking about today, which is really exciting. And active listening, accuracy, trauma-informed, I believe that is. Okay. So, okay, so I think, Shirley, I think that we can keep on going here just for time purposes. So, so again, thank you everybody for participating. I think I'm going to try to keep all those components that we just talked about, right, or that you guys were answering throughout the presentation. So I'm sure that we can bring it back. So these first couple of slides really come down to making sure that we all understand the terminology that we use when it comes to these tools, right? So a screening is meant to diagnose or identify a certain experience and used with a predetermined population, right? So in particular, what we're talking about today, it's going to be the process of determining if an individual meets the definition of victim of human trafficking per the federal law or relevant state laws, right? And so, yeah, it's meant to diagnose or identify a certain experience. And while an assessment is generally used by experts when there are indications of trafficking in a potential case, it can be considered more comprehensive and longer than I guess what would be in a screening in this case. And it's used to confirm cases for criminal investigations. So that's a really quick overview of those two terms. So if you're looking to see which one you're looking to use for your agency, which one's proper, that's kind of a quick component that's in terms of terminology. And so for the purposes of today, we're mainly going to be focusing on the screening components of these types of cases. So if you wouldn't mind, let's go to this next slide. Okay, so in this slide, we wanted to include additional terms that are used and might be helpful. And so the first one is indicators of human trafficking checklist, and which is, that's the name of it, right? And it's a checklist to identify the risk factors for potential victims of human trafficking. We've heard, you know, positives and negatives of this type of checklist, and I think that you'll probably be able to make your own decision as to whether you'd want to use this type of checklist based on what we're sharing with you today. But so yeah, that's another option that people talk about here. And the second definition here is a universal education approach, which, as stated here, is based on educating patients or clients about or individuals about the potential abuse in normalizing matter that opens up conversations with patients, clients, individuals, so that they may share those experiences. This is something many of you already do, but maybe you don't know the terminology of the universal education approach, and we'll talk about that here in some upcoming slides. So again, it's something that I think it's a term that maybe not all of us know that we're using, but we're identifying it as such today. So so again, these are some terms that are useful to know throughout this presentation, as well as in the field, and it'll help you learn about the different scenarios that you might be in and how you want to handle them. So let's go to the next slide here. And I'm sure many of you have questions why it's important to discuss specifically labor trafficking. And Charlie already highlighted clearly in her experience and examples. Again, thanks for sharing that, Charlie. And in addition to what she was saying, we know that screening for human trafficking is an important component for the provision of services, right? Because federal and state laws clearly define human trafficking as a specific crime, right? And as such, many programs and funding sources are specific to serve human trafficking victims or survivors. And a screening tool has to be done in order to determine whether they're eligible or not. All of these needs have to be, or you have to find the relevant elements, right? And know what the AMP model says, whether it's the action means purpose, the age of the victims, the documentation, the documents, and including the determination of whether the screening resulted in a positive identification of a trafficking case, if sufficient, if the screening is sufficient and it hasn't been done, if a trafficking case can't be determined, that also is going to help out. And when it comes to labor, what makes it really challenging is that you're not only talking about one industry, right? But really almost in all the things that you can think about, right? So nuances in different industries make it harder or more challenging to identify or maybe a little overwhelming, right? Understanding the definitions can get complicated, and we all need to understand the distinction between concepts, right? So for example, having an understanding of labor laws, child labor violations, labor exploitation versus what labor trafficking is. You might say, is it important to know that during a screening, right? In my opinion, you might not view it as such, but it really helps you out when you're in a scenario. When you're doing a screening, you can feel more confident in making a determination because you understand the context in which the potential trafficking is taking place. So in conducting these trainings throughout the US, I've realized that when it comes to labor cases, people aren't necessarily comfortable with some of these cases, and not to mention that it's important to know how different state and federal laws might impact the cases. So for example, based in Florida, in this case, you don't have to prove the coercion component when it comes to minor labor trafficking. And why is that important? Because you have to prove that under federal law, right? So, which means that services might vary depending on the scenario. So when I talk about the different tools you use, you have to make sure that you know what you're basing it off of. But one thing is, please don't be intimidated when it comes to identifying and using a screening tool for labor cases. While it might be overwhelming, that's definitely something that we're trying to bring down and minimize any concern today. And so, yeah, let's hope that we can get started with that. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now we've talked about some basic components, right, about screening, assessments, and different terminology. And I wanted to talk about the entire process of conducting a screening, right, or interview. And as I said initially, we're going to achieve this today by looking at these two stages. And the pre-screening, what should hopefully be in place before you even start conducting these screenings. What to do during a screening, and a continuation of that is what happens after the screening. So right now, we're going to talk about the pre-screening components to consider. So the first thing we need to have in place and have established is the internal response protocol that addresses multiple components. Okay, and I'm not sure if you all have listened to the previous video that we did with Framework, but if you haven't, and it talks about different training tips for supervisors regarding labor trafficking, and please feel free to watch it because there we talk about the relevance of training your staff and to have the proper tools and do their job properly, right? And in this case, what's important is to train them on the concept of labor trafficking, right? The concepts that I mentioned earlier, the difference between, labor exploitation, child labor exploitation, and of course the AMP model. Training and that kind of thing is basic here. You need to train them to make sure that they understand the protocols, as well as, mandatory reporting for minors as well. And terminology, I think that it's also important to discuss. For example, when, people use, survivor or victim, what's the difference between them? If you're working with a vulnerable population, like with disabilities, and you say deaf mute or hearing impaired, how it'll affect the person if it's the first time you're talking with them. In the training with your staff, using the proper term, for example, with people with disabilities is, deaf or hard of hearing. And it might be useful to use that type of terminology and starting with the right foot and establishing trust and rapport. So all in all, in that box, your staff need to, and you as an individual need to be knowledgeable and experienced professionals to offer and use the trauma-informed interview skills that that we were talking about and that we're going to be talking about today. And an agency will also need to train on the tool as well. So for example, when testing out the tool with the new staff, is shadowing an option, right, with your agency when training? What benefits does that offer your agency, and while not making it invasive on the person that you're screening? So again, that's just that one training component of staff that I can't highlight enough. The location of where the screening is conducted also dictates quite a bit. It's important to have the process the process in place so that your staff know exactly what to do in different scenarios. So for example, your agency, does your agency only do intakes in your office? Are you equipped or allowed to meet them elsewhere? How does this impact screening labor cases in particular? So for example, will all of those cases that might be exploited be able to go to your office? Is this a limitation? So will they be intimidated by going into your office? On the flip side, have a protocol also for, is there a midpoint, a safe place to talk that, you know, maybe is not where the exploitation might be taking place or not in the office. But furthermore, what's needed is that there's a policy in place and that you need to know what you're going to be doing in that kind of situation, right? So I know that for most labor cases, not at least the ones that I've done weren't done in my office, but again, it varies depending on the agency that you're talking about. So in the third box here, the translator interpreter service, this is an obvious need for the foreign-born or that don't speak English well enough for their comfort, and we need to make sure that we do this and have everything set up, which actually leads to this next referral and resource list, because you need to have something in place for if you are screening and you need to make proper referrals, say if it's immigration attorneys or law enforcement, community advocates, whatever it is, you need to have those in place so that you feel comfortable doing it. Lastly, though, the main message that we see here is that you don't want to create any type of harm. So anything that you're doing in terms of your internal policy, first, do no harm. Throughout this, you don't want to ask anything that you think will create any harm, be invasive, and you want to make sure that it's done in a safe environment, okay? So let's go to this next slide. I know that I have to be cautious with time here, so I'll try to be very quick with this. So, okay, so considerations for the screening tool, right, that you're looking at. So aside from all of what we just talked about, the questions is what considerations should you have when selecting the proper tool, right? So has the tool been validated? Is that component of validity important to your agency? I believe some people mentioned that it was important. What language should it be in? We might ask that because it might be in the area of the US that there's a highly likelihood of someone that speaks a different language, and maybe your staff also speak that language. Does it matter if you have a different tool for emergency or general situations? You might ask that because there are scenarios in which you might need to be very quick. And I believe somebody also answered that initially in our questions. Another question is, what role do I play? Are you a supervisor, a direct staff person? Is the tool victim-centered? And again, I believe some people said that initially, and it's very important as well. And is the tool inclusive of all the populations that being served? That includes individuals with disabilities, foreign nationals, individuals who identify themselves as LGBTQ, children, adults, the list goes on, male and female. And lastly, the question that to ask is, what's the minimum information we need to screen this case, right? That leads us to the main component that all screenings should have. And let's go to this next slide, please, Charlie. So all in all, we need to be looking for labor components and the purpose behind this, which is force, fraud, and coercion. So again, labor, force, fraud, or coercion, right? If there are certain things that you leave with today's presentation, please remember this slide, because again, we need to be looking for that. But at the same time, we need to make sure, again, be curious but not invasive, and remember only to ask what's necessary. The reality is that, you know, if you want to be quick and you want to be direct, that's what we need to go through. So let's go to this next slide, please. Okay, so here's some screening tools that some agencies have been using. I'm not going to go in depth into them really because of time purposes, but feel free to look into them or reach out to us after if you have any questions. With that being said, though, I'll give a quick overview. The quick youth indicators of trafficking tool is that, so that's a comprehensive trafficking screening tool that can be considered brief and shouldn't require a trafficking expert really to conduct. It's a validated tool and it focuses on runaway and homeless youth. The trafficking victims identification tool is for both sex and labor trafficking. And an interesting component to that is that it includes limitations to the tool, the tips for interviewing, and frequently asked questions. Another aspect worth highlighting here is that the tool includes short and long versions. That is interesting because you can adapt it to the specific need that you have at that time. And lastly, what we've included here is the examples from the Florida Department of Children and Families, which is also named the Human Trafficking Screening Tool. And this tool not only includes questions that you can build off of, but also language for internal or agency use. Other sections also should be read to potential victims and instructions to help the screener out and that sort of thing. So again, it's a tool that's helpful and worth looking at if you're serving minors. But with those examples already talked about briefly, screening tools as a whole might be helpful to start if you're unsure of how to screen, and that might lead to other methods of screening though. And that's actually the universal education examples. And those are based on empowerment and starting where the client's at, being non-judgmental, not pushing for disclosure, and offer information and support. Educate to the best of your abilities while conducting the screening by providing scenarios of what you've seen, for example, in other cases, literature and that kind of stuff. And some people I know have been critical of screening tools because they said it's somewhat mechanical. And the universal education, I guess, can give you another option if you're looking into that. And lastly, something that we included here are questions integrated into internal screenings is when you're feeling like you have already a baseline of the screening tool and you've adjusted it to your specific needs, incorporating variables that you've seen useful in the cases that you serve and that sort of thing. So as a whole, like I said, screening tools can be a good starting point if you're unfamiliar to learn what questions to ask. But once familiarized, you might feel comfortable with going in a different order of the questions and having kind of like a what brought you in today type of conversation, where it's a natural conversation and you feel like that you can follow the client's lead, have a natural talk and as to what's going on, more organic, a real conversation with people, and that can take place when you feel confident with the subject and can manage the main components that we should be looking into. So let's go here to this next slide, if you don't mind. So okay. In this slide, our intent is to show how you can add to existing tools and add relevant questions that you feel the need to understand in a scenario during an emergency intake. So please note that these types of questions also come with proper training and experience, and once staff understand what's relevant when it comes to a labor trafficking case. So to start though, we wanted to share with you an all-encompassing type of question that's helpful when considering both sex and labor trafficking. And that's a question that you can add to your tool if it's not already there, or that this type of thing. And that question that we labeled kind of like the leading question, right? In a work situation of any kind, have you ever felt pressured, forced, or expected to work and you couldn't walk away from the job based on fear or harm to others? So in this question, we know that that you can address all types of industries. As I said, can fall under this type of kind of a human trafficking category rather than it being a sex or a labor question. And you can build off of this, use other screening tools, but this at least is a helpful starting point that you can look into in case of a quick or emergency intake that you need. And in terms of the potential follow-up questions, we can see a difference between the closed and open-ended questions. Many of the screening tools include closed questions, which is fine, don't get me wrong, and unreasonable, but open-ended questions should help out to provide what you're also looking for. So the first question you see here, have you ever worked a job that was different or to what you agreed to or expected to? The job could be unofficial, like drug selling, or sorry, drug sales, chores, babysitting, or working at a family business? We know this is a closed-ended question, but the follow-up will vary depending on the response. So in this example, individuals that you're screening might say yes or no, but if they say yes, but they don't elaborate on it, you have to learn the labor component about it, right? So it's important to ask, what's different in this job, or how was this different? How was this job different? So in these types of follow-up questions, it's important to know how your agency feels about them, of course, and how comfortable you are with them while being curious, but again, not invasive in any sort of way. Again, there needs to be focus on the training component to make sure that you're asking it properly and that you know when to ask this sort of thing. And the second example here in a similar vein, have you ever worked without getting the payment you thought you would? And again, it's a closed-ended question, yes or no, is what you could answer. If they don't elaborate on that, an option that you can ask, as it shows here, how was that payment different? So you can have different options in the type of question that you're going for. These are just some examples that we thought of sharing with you and that you should take into consideration. And this last question, sometimes people are prevented from leaving a work situation or their job by their employers. Have you ever been afraid to leave or quit a job due to fear of violence or threat to yourselves or others? So while this question is actually similar to the leading question that we talked about initially, a difference is how we address, pressure, force, or an expectation in the leading one. And which might trigger actually a different response, right? Again, I understand that there might be very subtle differences that we're talking about in the concepts, but especially if you're making an emergency intake that you have a little amount of time to do a screening, you need to be very targeted and not only, have the questions that you've pre-selected, but know the type of follow-up questions that would be important to you. So if you do ask this last question, though, you can follow it up with, what made you afraid? And again, this is like in this question in particular, afraid would be a key component to the follow-up question that you're looking into. So let's go to this next slide, if you don't mind, Charlie. Okay, so on this slide, we wanted to address additional considerations while thinking about potential questions to integrate. Let me start, of course, by saying that understanding nuances within industries is important. That can always give you clues to properly understand the type of scenario that they're in. With that being said, though, your tool or follow-ups don't have to differentiate between industries. So like, sex work, babysitting, or construction, just to give you guys some examples here that are listed. If you or your staff, work with the understanding of a certain concept of what trafficking is, you should be able to work the different scenarios and looking into those concepts of force, fraud, or coercion, and have catch-all questions, right? So that can assist in all types of cases. So, please consider these types of questions, these catch-all questions that we put here, moving forward, because I think that it should be something that is looked into, because if you guys are already feeling comfortable working with sex trafficking cases, that you incorporate them, because it should be able to work to all of this. And this actually leads me to my second point here, is that another aspect that's related, and that I believe that I've received some questions or calls about, is that, and it's worth highlighting, is that, when you're screening a sex trafficking case, for example, that was referred as such, you shouldn't immediately exclude labor trafficking in the case. Ask related questions that, again, might not be invasive, but that can provide information. So again, if it's a sex trafficking case at an establishment of sorts, it might be good to ask, if there was any work related to waitressing or serving drinks, that sort of thing. It might be something that we weren't looking at because of the referral, but it's important to look into to make sure that we are providing services to the case as needed and being properly represented, that it was both sex and labor, a potential sex and labor case. So wrapping up the slide, though, please remember in terms of emergency cases that you're considering incorporating, having a lead question that understands both sex and labor, and the labor component, as well as force, fraud, and coercion, and that has to be a catch-all component. So that's what we're trying to see here. So let's go to this next slide. Perfect. Okay. So we've reviewed some of the concepts of the pre-screening that are aspects to consider, and it leads us to the actual screening, right? So Let's go to this next one again. Okay, so one of the first variables to consider when conducting the actual screening is how the location might impact. And I know that it might seem like like a minor thing, but when you are in person, of course, the interaction is a lot easier to read and different than if you are. With that being said, though, I know that, currently, some agencies are requiring masks because of the pandemic and safety, that sort of stuff. So how does that influence how you interact with people? Does it at all? It's something to consider. And in comparison to that, where we have remote options, right? We have a lot of screenings that take place like that now, whether it's an emergency situation or they can't meet with you because the trafficking is still taking place and they can't leave. So now, of course, people are accustomed to video calls, but we don't know if say technology won't work with us that day and the internet shuts down. And it isn't easily worked out, something like that. So we have to know the important components of how both variables in terms of location, whether it's in person or remote, might affect that. So when planning it out, please take that into consideration. And let's go to this next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, we wanted to highlight considerations with the screening itself. So we need to keep in mind that to always allow the person that you are interviewing to lead the conversation. While of course we have questions that we want to know, and it's not about forcing the conversation or the subject. They might need to talk about something specific, some like other aspects of the case first. If that's the case, listen, be patient with the process. The conversation can organically actually lead you to where you need to go. If you're present and not focused on, say, a meeting you have later, or the phone might be ringing, all of that, all these components being present will always help you out. And, being present will also make sure that you remember like industry related questions that you might need to consider. Being focused might be an obvious statement, but since, we live in a world that, we multitask and we have all kinds of important things to do, I wanted to talk about that. But back to the industry component, since we're talking about labor trafficking, it's important to have the basic understanding of the different industries that we might encounter and how that might influence your questions. So another consideration is that we need to understand the population as to how or who you're talking to, right? So in that case, in this case, foreign-born individuals, please remember the methods of control and storytelling might be different. Withholding of documents or the way they explain what happened to them might be different based on their culture or language. It's important to recognize this while conducting the screening. And another population I can use as an example are in terms of power dynamics are, with when you're screening a minor, and looking at the power dynamics of the minor and adults, the methods of control that the adults might have with minors might be a little different. So it's something else to take into consideration when you're screening who you're talking to, right? So again, what clearly we need to take into consideration with scenarios is to have an understanding of the labor trafficking components what they are, and what is considered labor exploitation. With proper training, it'll be helpful to distinguish between these, but you have to understand that or it's helpful when you're conducting a screening. And lastly, we have to keep this in mind, is that we don't want to impose our thoughts on them. We don't judge one way or another. So for example, conducting labor trafficking screenings with adults, and they don't know how to read or write in their own language, let alone in English. But I've also done screenings with adults that have master's levels. And so at no point should I be imposing my thoughts about either of those types of cases, their backgrounds, what they've faced, or anything in that sort of sort. So it's important that we keep that component in check when we're doing our screenings as well. So let's go to this next slide. Okay, so ideally, these are the steps that you should consider. First, of course, it's easier said than done. We'll be breaking these down a little bit more in these upcoming slides to establish rapport and inform the process. But before, just to touch upon that really quickly, it'll offer insight and trust. Why should they believe in who you are? Why should they believe in the services that you're talking about? By informing them of the process that'll be taking place, it'll be extremely helpful. Be clear with that, but not mechanical. This step might vary depending on the scenario that you're in, whether it's an emergency intake or longer screening in person, on the phone, in your office, in the house, at a law enforcement department office. So all of that can, so yeah, I mean, you get the idea as to how all of that can impact the establishing of the rapport, but all of this doesn't take away from the fact that you should be able to get the rapport starting at least to get established and informing them of the process as to what will take place with the screening. In the second step, we will of course will vary with the scenario, but the basics, like seeing if you need to use the restroom or some water or that kind of stuff, should be included. Again, I'll go over that in these upcoming slides in a little more detail. But so for step 3, it's pretty self-explanatory, conducting the screening using the tool you selected, or the method, right? And be prepared for the follow-up questions. And so the last that I've listed here, last 2, observe and listen throughout and communicate, will be talked about as well in more detail, and communicating next steps. So let's go to this. Let's start addressing actually the basic needs. And I'll be very quick again, because I know that we have some limited time. So as I was saying in addressing this, while the concept shouldn't change, what you offer to address in terms of the basic needs might vary depending on the scenario. So if you're conducting it at the home of the person, of course, you're not going to be offering certain things versus how you do it in your office. But the main thing here is to address the ways for them to feel comfortable, and that they aren't here just to get information. You aren't here just to get information off of them, that you're interested in the person feeling welcome. And that, we've listed some examples here, bathroom chargers, Wi-Fi passcode, and that sort of thing. But so just as a quick anecdote, actually, I did work a labor trafficking case years ago with a partnering law enforcement agency that identified a case and was asked to do a screening to potentially receive services. And she was very proactive in trying to help them out and ordering fast food for them to eat. And I won't say, the restaurant, because I don't want to put any kind of negative light on them, but let's just say that it wasn't very culturally sensitive to the individuals that were being identified, that were coming from a Mayan descent. And they didn't eat the food. They didn't eat, even though they were hungry, they just kind of left it there. So just to highlight that while the intent was there to make them feel comfortable, I guess it's also important to highlight the cultural components in these scenarios. But again, back to introducing yourself, the agency, so you want to introduce yourself, the agency you work for, the role that you play. And I know it's tricky because you don't want to lead them into any type of answers. In my opinion, you have to be very careful of saying, for example, we serve victims of trafficking, et cetera, because they might feel obligated to tell some kind of story. Personally, I prefer to hear what happened to them organically. These questions, in the screening tool and follow-ups should provide more information, but you have to be cautious with how you're introducing yourself. I always found it challenging in that sort of sense, but yeah, just wanted to highlight that. And offering an overview of the process is crucial, like I mentioned earlier. So that it can ease the expectations and they won't be blindsided about where you're coming from. In terms of offering an interpreter, I've been in this situation where they don't speak anything aside from their native language. Or that they say they speak English, but they're not fluent. So what's important here, though, is that the individual being screened is feeling comfortable and describing what's happening to them. And they might not want to have an interpreter because they don't know if the interpreter is someone from their community, and they want to avoid anyone knowing about the conversation. So again, just be prepared to offer it if possible, and then you take it from there. Sharing estimates of time is another some additional source of information that can be considered as giving an overview to the process. And you want to let them know how long it'll be taken to create any less stress or anxiety throughout these steps, and having a good example of what all this is going to go into is important. So again, I'll be relatively quick here. So again, if you want to address any fears, this is the right time to do it when you're first starting the conversation, and you can lead it off that. So let's go to this next slide, if you don't mind, and I'll set it up a little bit. Perfect. Okay. So now we're going into an example that we developed here, so you can look at how you can address the basic needs and building the rapport. And just for context purposes, what you'll be hearing and seeing is actually a longer video that we're working on of a case example. And this is just an introduction, but it's based off of different domestic servitude cases that we've worked. And at this point, the screener had called, and it was based on a referral of a friend and who they met at church. So please let's go into that.
Hi, Diana. My name is Matias Dominguez, and I'm an advocate for Agency for Humanitarian Assistance. And one of our functions is to try to help and try to connect people to resources. Before we get started, how are you doing? Can I try to get you anything like water, a snack, a phone charger, show you where the bathroom is, something like that?
I'm okay for now.
If anything comes up, just let me know. I'd like to help out in any way that I can. To start, I'd like to hear more about what's going on with you and make sure I don't miss anything you need help with. Would it be okay if we took 15 minutes and ask you some questions?
Yeah, that's fine.
Just so that you're aware, sometimes the questions may be personal or uncomfortable, and I'll try and let you know why I'm asking specific things. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to, and we can stop at any time. I also want you to know that your safety is my priority. I tell everyone that by law, everything you say will be kept completely confidential unless you describe a situation where you or someone else is in immediate danger or at risk of being abused or hurting someone, okay? Any questions or worry areas I can answer right now before we get started?
My friend said that you can help people whose documents are expired without them getting into trouble. Is that right? I need a new passport and I'm not positive about my visa.
Right, so we're not the police and we don't discriminate based on documentation status. We're here to help everyone however we can, but today we'll see if I can help you out or our agency, or if it's better that I connect you with another agency that's better equipped or better fit to help you out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. You can ask me whatever.
Okay, so after that introduction in this video, we're actually going to be picking up halfway through the actual screening of where this conversation is taking place. And again, for context, the friend had referred the case to reach out for the agency for a passport issue that that this individual Diana was having, which leads to more questions as to what's been going on with the case. And please note that the follow-up questions aren't based necessarily on the screening tool, but it's based on the conversation, so that it isn't mechanical in that sense. So yeah, sorry, please go right ahead.
So you said you want help with an expired passport and maybe a visa. Can you tell me a little bit about what's been going on there?
So I came here over 20 years ago with the Soto family, who I love very much. They helped me get my passport and visa, but now my passport is expired and I need to go visit my mother who is sick. The Sotos say that they'll help me next time they go back to Peru. I've been asking them to give me my passport so I can get it renewed, but Ms. Soto gets angry with me, so now I just try to avoid it. I'm just nervous for my mom.
Really sorry to hear about your mother. That sounds like a really hard situation. Have the Sotos always kept your passport? Is that the reason why they have it?
I guess so. They just say it's for safekeeping.
If I asked you to get your passport today, would they give it to you?
No, I don't think so.
I was just asking because some past clients have had employers who keep their documents to pressure them not to leave or to do work in particular. So has anything like that ever happened to you?
No, they've never said I wasn't allowed to leave. They just get worried about the kids. They always need me for the kids or their neighbors' chores.
Yeah, that's a lot. I'm also curious, what does it look like when Miss Soto gets mad?
She just makes me feel guilty about not taking care of the kids. Sometimes she yells or stops talking to me. Sometimes she stops giving me permission to go to church or takes money from my salary.
It makes sense why you might avoid making her upset. When she yells, does she ever hurt you or make you feel like unsafe in any other way?
No, she loves me and hasn't ever hurt me. Mostly I just get sad I always disappoint her.
Perfect. Okay. So let's go to this next slide here. So certain concepts that are listed here in the observe and listen slide aren't necessarily easily spotted in the example that we offered, and others are. So for example, prioritizing the client's safety and comfort can be illustrated no matter what the context is, right? And the same goes for offering grounding tools or breaks if necessary. In the past example, the break might not have been necessary just yet, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be aware of that in certain instances. The third point here is that we've highlighted is listening to indicators and be curious when it's necessary and obtain more information when it's needed. And so not just for the sake of knowing, but be respectful and only ask what's needed. And in addition to that, be conscious of the language that you're speaking and that you're using, mirroring the language of the potential victim uses, it can be a helpful tool. And you know, that component, I'll be very quick here, just for time purposes, but you know, in terms of the language, also, you know, normalizing the client's feelings of the person. So it's important, like in your screening tool, you might have that the victim might have lost control of their lives by the trafficker. So with that in mind, though, offer as much control as possible during the screening, so that it can be used to assist in building trust. And so the last point here is that you might want to know, again, it might not be that important to you right now, but it's important to, you know, monitor the facial and body language components of the person that you're screening. The cultural components should be forgotten. There are cultures that might not want to look at you in the eye because they view you as an authority figure. And that's just, you know, one example that I can talk about when it comes to that. But it's also important for us to monitor our own body language. You know, like I know that, for example, you know, if you have your arms crossed or if you have them at the hips, it portrays a different type of language that you're trying to, you know, use. So it's something to keep in mind. So let's actually go to this next video again. For time purposes, I'm trying to be very quick. So here's another video that we've used that's based also on the observe and listen concepts that we've been reviewing. And again, there's a fine line with trying to get the proper information but not being invasive, and trying to use the proper assessment. So here we go.
To hear you feel safe, but I'm sorry to hear you feel like a disappointment. It sounds like you work really hard and care a great deal about your job. Can you help me understand your work, what you do on a daily basis and that sort of thing?
It's changed with time. At first I was doing all the chores, managing the house and yard, and taking care of the kids. Now I do all that and help out the Soto's friends. I love the children, and I feel like their second mother, but I get tired. I don't want Miss Soto to get mad at me though, so I do it all.
Do the other families pay you directly?
No, I think they pay Miss Soto, but since it's part of the week, it doesn't impact my pay.
How often do you work for the Sotos and the other families?
I'm expected to take care of the household from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 5 days a week, but it varies. If they have people over on weekends, I'll help. At first, I didn't work for the other families. Now maybe every other week.
And I hope you don't mind me asking. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but would you mind telling me how much you make?
They pay me $300 a week, but anything they pay for is deducted from my pay. Like the trip here with a visa was about $2,500. My rent, food, that sort of thing.
Perfect. Okay, so those are just examples, but after you've done the screening, you might want to make sure that you communicate the next steps, and you know, if you want to avoid any type of misinterpretations, right? But this all starts with having a safety plan in place. You know, if at the time of the conversation, if the person that you've talked with isn't ready to leave, you can still offer them the option. You know, that if they're willing to change their mind, something like that. On the same line, always inform the methods of reaching out to you, the numbers, or to you or your agency in case of an emergency. You want to make sure that they have an avenue to reach out to you or your representative from your agency. In terms of relevant information to share, it's important that they feel empowered by what we're doing, and explain to them whatever components that they need to understand in the scenario. That includes, you know, whether it's symptoms or experiences, or rights for that matter. So the next step, based on the scenario that we're working, it's whether it's treatment or that it can assist the individual being screened, referrals being made, and resources in the community, and so on. And so, of course, it'll change depending on what the individual needs, right? But it brings us back to all this, that we're making sure that we feel that they are comfortable and that we can properly assess certain things. And finally, we're scheduling a plan for barriers. So really, it's again for the person to feel safe, and that we've considered, you know, their transportation or systems that might be a challenge to them. And you know, you heard what they were saying and as to what their needs are, and it's important that we share it with them. So let's go to this next slide. I believe it's the final video. Yeah. So in this one, we're going to talk about, or we're going to go over an example of what to say, you know, how to wrap up this conversation with Diana, and how we worked it out. So please.
Anna, it sounds like you have a lot of love for the children you work with and the Soto family as a whole, really. But after talking with you today, I'm a little worried about some of the similarities I'm hearing in your experiences and the experiences of some past clients I've worked with. Even though you like where you live and it sounds like you feel safe, I wonder about your pay and the deductions from your paychecks. I'm also curious about the use of guilt by Miss Soto, if I'm honest with you, and that she isn't willing to give you your passport, now that you've been asking for it. From my perspective, that sounds like a coercive situation, which is a violation of your rights. Can I give you some material to read while I look at my schedule so we can have follow-up conversations? Then we can talk about next steps to get your passport when we meet next and how you can contact me if needed.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks for that. So again, I'll try to be very, very quick with all this because I know that we're getting really close to the end of this. So this all leads to what happens after the screening, right? And so to start, I wanted to address the best practice that might be obvious, but it can't go ahead without being stated. And if it's determined to be a case, you communicate with the individual and you coordinate follow-up meetings like we talked about, addressing the needs, working with the case or a service plan, putting them in touch with partnering agencies, that sort of stuff. But while again, that might be given, we also have to at least mention that in the situations in which the potential trafficking case wasn't determined to be a labor trafficking situation, of course, you have to communicate this with them, explain anything that you need. But you shouldn't just stop there, right? As a best practice, we still should, be prepared to make any potential referrals if you have services that you know of that they might need. Prepare for them, beforehand for a warm handoff and share resources as needed. Again, if they aren't eligible for your program, that doesn't mean that they might not be able to get services somewhere else. And it's important that you offer them that sort of type of service. So let's go to this next slide. So in most cases, hopefully, you'll be able to make a determination on your own as to whether it's a labor trafficking case or not. However, there might be the I'm not sure moments, right? So cases that might be convoluted or a little, or you might be a little unsure of. So in that case, it's essential to have a supportive team to run things by. And, whether it's a supervisor, other staff, subject matter experts, your funder, immigration attorneys that you're working with, that you can talk about different scenarios with them. And of course, people like in framework that that might have insight, and just know that you aren't there on your own, that you can reach out to people and talk about scenarios that you're seeing, and discuss why it might not be an easy trafficking case. So let's go to this next slide. Perfect. Okay. So in this slide, we wanted to address certain pitfalls, right? So we want to learn about the types of scenarios that we can't just assume that everything will be, the person will understand everything that you're talking about, that the message that you're getting across is going to be completely understood. That isn't always the case, and you want to make sure that your language is being proper and it's that it won't be misinterpreted. And the second, like I mentioned in other slides, is that the follow-up questions or your meeting, you want to make sure that you have and that you clarify any components that you might need to have a second meeting, that it won't just be in one, and that's an important component as well. You don't want to overpromise or referrals that might put you in a bind or lose trust. It's not necessary to overpromise or to gain their trust, but you want to make sure that you're somebody that's reliable, right? Like I mentioned, prior training on the screening tool is essential, and that's including how to use it and understanding the concepts, like I said that. And a misconception and that I want to highlight here in the this one of these points here is that only labor trafficking can happen to foreign-born victims, right, of labor trafficking. And that in Florida, I can tell you that in Central Florida, which is I'm located in Florida, that we see a great deal of traveling sales crew minor domestic cases. We can't and we shouldn't ignore those cases. So while I know most of the cases that I've worked are with foreign-born individuals, labor trafficking isn't exclusive to them. So U.S. nationals should be considered when talking about these cases. And lastly, all labor trafficking cases are the same, that type of misconception. And that's not the case at all. Of course, there might be some similarities in the industries or methods of control, that kind of thing, but there are unique parts to it and that you should take into account when you're looking into these types of cases. So Let me see here. I'm trying to wrap up here. So there we go. Okay. So in wrapping up the presentation, I wanted to quote Mr. Bruce Lee, who I'm sure many of you all know as from their martial arts field and that kind of thing. But he once said, "Be like water, my friend." And there's more to this quote, but he's referring to adapting to the situation that you're facing. I'm connecting this to what we're talking about today in trying to say that you should adapt to your screening and your needs. Be like water, mold yourself to what's needed, meet them where they're at, and assist them in any way that you can. All the screening tools that we use need to lead to proper identification. Remember, that's the goal, and we have to adjust and mold ourselves to be like that. So be like water, that's what I'm trying to tell you all. And again, I know I'm giving little time for question and answers, but please go ahead and let's try to have a conversation if you guys have any other needs. So actually, Charlie, here, did you want to talk about this one real quick about feedback and potential other trainings that you guys have coming up?
Yes, so everyone, please share your feedback for this event. We know that we ran over, but we'll try to address one question now, and then all of the rest of the questions we don't get to, Chris will write responses to and follow up. So we will share all
Absolutely.
of them out. We'll share the videos that we made. You all can use them to practice. And let's just start with, I have worked with a few people that have limited English and feel offended if you offer an interpreter. I've also worked with clients who just feel uncomfortable with interpreters from their communities. So how can the audience members handle those situations?
I think that if anything, like in terms, I don't want to generalize, because I think that it's something that we should look at as a case by case scenario, right? Like what makes them feel uncomfortable about somebody that isn't in the community. Again, you don't want to lose their trust, but I do think that it is important to highlight that you're trying to understand their situation properly. That it isn't about insulting them in any sort of way. That that it's something that you've used with other people, and that I'll be more than happy to kind of adjust as needed, but that it's something that's helpful for you, not for them to be insulted, but it's like that it's a tool that you need for that. That's the way that I think that you want to make sure that you're not disrespecting them in any sort of way, and build off of that. But again, if you want to talk about that separately, we can talk about it, with Framework and myself, and see about the specific situation that you're talking about, and see if we can help you out off of it.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you to everyone who attended today. Feel free to share your feedback with our survey or sign up for our upcoming events. Our next event will be in January and focus on naming and healing from trauma, because we've talked about how a lot of survivors experience labor trafficking, and sometimes it's not identified until later on when they have to self-identify while they're listening to something or watching a movie, working with a client 20 years after it happened. So we have a lot of power here to support these survivors, and this event will be survivor-led. We appreciate your time and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.